supporters of Ukraine's opposition groups also staged protests here in New York outside the Federal Reserve Bank. And they're demanding a probe into financial institutions which they claim are bankrolling the government of Viktor Yanukovych. Liling Tan reports.
A show of solidarity with their counterparts in Kiev, young Ukrainians, about 40 of them, demonstrated outside the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. They're pushing for a probe into ties linking European and American financial institutions with the government of Viktor Yanukovych.
Freeze accounts, that's what these protesters here are chanting behind me. In fact, this is the latest in a series of protests that have been taking place across New York City, and it comes the day after a similar one was held outside the United Nations in New York. But whether it's the UN or the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, their message is clear. They've had it with what they call the authoritarian regime of Viktor Yanukovych.
We've been putting up with the constant corruption, the fact that he has collected over several $1 billion in his own personal wealth. We're angry about that, and we want him to leave at this point.
My major role was anti-corruption activities, basically informing the governments, informing the banks, the regulators that some of the foreign banks, they are cooperating, they are servicing our politicians, our corrupted politicians, and that some of the funds that they hold could have been generated via corruption.
Protesters allege that funds from a corrupt Ukraine are being laundered via the international financial system through shell companies and intermediaries, including UniCredit Bank of Austria and Deutsche Bank, the target of protests earlier this month. The New York protesters offered no evidence to support their accusations, although government corruption in Ukraine is a widely held assumption shared by the demonstrators here and in Kiev. With no response from either bank, protesters here say they've shifted their focus to the Federal Reserve Bank responsible for monitoring U.S. dollar transactions.
We believe that the Federal Reserve System and the United States in general can help Ukraine tremendously by investigating the money laundering schemes used by Ukrainian officials, including the ones who are to blame for the bloodshed in Kiev.
Protesters here are also calling for the White House and the State Department to issue sanctions against those who perpetrated the violence. Sanctions that may become more likely following Tuesday's bloodshed in Kiev that left more than 24 people dead. Liling Tan, CCTV, New York.